The winter of 1944 was a season of profound despair for the Third Reich. The strategic situation on both the eastern and western fronts was deteriorating rapidly and irreversibly. Adolf Hitler, retreating into the delusion of his bunker, conceived a final, audacious counteroffensive designed to split the Western Allies and force a negotiated peace. This desperate plan became known as Wat am Rhein, or the Battle of the Bulge, a massive, surprise thrust through the weakly held Ardennes forest. The central, non-negotiable requirement for this entire operation was speed, an aggressive, relentless drive toward the key objective of the Belgian port city of Antwerp. Antwerp was not merely a trophy, it was the essential, logistical lifeline through which the Allied armies received their staggering amounts of supplies. Hitler believed that capturing Antwerp would completely paralyze the Allied supply chain, forcing a complete pause in their advance and shattering the coalition's unity. The initial, overwhelming success of the German spearheads created genuine panic among the Allied forces, briefly reviving a fleeting sense of hope within the German High Command. Massive German armored divisions, including the elite Leibstandarte and Das Reich, plunged into the fog and snow with brutal, unexpected force. The primary, most urgent fuel for this entire armored juggernaut was not the Reich's dwindling reserves, but the vast stockpiles they expected to capture from the surprised Americans. The entire fate of the offensive, and perhaps the war in the West, was resting precariously upon this gamble, a desperate bet on seizing enemy fuel depots. Hitler's detailed operational orders explicitly forbade any deviation from the Antwerp objective, seeing this single victory as the total vindication of his strategic genius. The early days of the offensive saw astonishing, yet ultimately unsustainable, rates of advance, further fueling Hitler's increasingly detached sense of omnipotence. However, the rapid initial momentum masked a logistical nightmare that was already beginning to unfold in the icy, congested roads behind the forward units. The German gamble was not just about overcoming Allied defenses, it was a race against the calendar, the weather, and the most critical resource of mechanized warfare, gasoline. The vast majority of German fuel had already been consumed just to reach the Ardennes, leaving the entire advance hanging by the thin thread of captured American supplies. During the planning and the initial execution of the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's detachment from reality reached its absolute zenith. He was operating entirely within a self-constructed bubble of military fantasy, ignoring the grim reports of his most experienced field commanders. Generals like Model and von Rundstedt were deeply skeptical of the entire operation, recognizing the profound logistical and strategic risks. Hitler, however, dismissed their professional, cautious assessments as the defeatist mutterings of men lacking revolutionary will and strategic courage. He firmly believed that the sheer force of a surprise, massive attack would simply shatter the Western Front, just as it had in 1940, completely underestimating the Allies' resilience. His confidence was built on the flawed premise that the German war machine, despite 4 years of attritional combat, still possessed the capacity for such a massive, sustained effort. The Führer was obsessed with the idea of a miracle weapon or a single, brilliant stroke that could reverse the inexorable tide of the war. The Ardennes offensive was his ultimate, self-designed miracle, a direct reflection of his complete refusal to accept the reality of Germany's imminent and total defeat. In his mind, the capture of American gasoline was a foregone conclusion, a mere detail in the execution of his brilliant, master strategy. Any warnings about the scarcity of fuel or the strength of the rapidly mobilizing Allied reserves were simply filtered out or angrily rejected during his daily military briefings. Hitler saw any hesitation or rational argument as a personal betrayal of the National Socialist cause, often erupting into irrational, screaming rages in the face of counter-evidence. His decision-making process was by this time entirely devoid of pragmatic military consideration, driven instead by emotional impulse and historical grievance. He had become completely convinced that the Wehrmacht was being held back only by the incompetence or timidity of its leadership, not by the sheer weight of Allied material superiority. The entire planning phase was characterized by absolute secrecy and a total centralization of command, ensuring that no dissenting voice could undermine his grand design. He was effectively waging war against his own general staff, who increasingly feared his erratic behavior more than the Allied armies themselves. The grand illusion he harbored was that time was on Germany's side, and that the Ardennes victory would buy the necessary months for his promised new weapons to enter the fray. The port of Antwerp represented the literal beating heart of the Allied war effort in northwest Europe. Its capture was not an optional secondary target but the absolute, core objective for the German Ardennes offensive. Following the D-Day landings, the Allies had struggled with the critical problem of supply, constantly hampered by the limited capacity of the improvised port at Cherbourg and the beach landings. The seizure and full operation of the massive deep-water port of Antwerp in late 1944 was a game-changing logistical victory for the Allies. Antwerp's docks could handle an astronomical volume of men, equipment, and, most critically, fuel, transforming the pace of the Allied advance. To the German military planners, the successful operation of this port was an open wound, the source of the immense, crushing material superiority the Allies possessed. Hitler's strategic vision focused on a crippling blow, capturing Antwerp, holding it, and destroying its operational capacity. This single act, he believed, would instantly leave dozens of Allied divisions stranded without oil, ammunition, and vital winter supplies. The entire German armored force was pointed like a massive, concentrated dagger directly at the city, with the commanders instructed to bypass all other objectives. Crucially, the success of the drive required a sustained, incredibly high rate of movement, which was absolutely impossible without seizing the vast Allied fuel reserves located along the route. The captured fuel was designated as the Lebensmittel, the very lifeblood, of the attack, without which the tanks would simply become immobile, frozen steel monuments. The German strategy was therefore a paradoxical logistical gamble. They needed to capture a resource they did not possess in order to sustain the attack that would enable the capture. Had the German spearheads reached the port, the immediate logistical chaos and military fallout for the Allies would have been catastrophic and possibly war-altering. The sheer desperation of this strategy underscored the German military's deep-seated resource crisis by the late stages of 1944. Hitler's single-minded focus on this prize blinded him to the growing tactical failures and the impossibility of the narrow fuel margin required for success. Antwerp remained tantalizingly close in the maps of the Wolfschanze but was in reality an ever-increasing, unreachable distance for the fuel-starved panzer divisions. Hitler's orders concerning the Ardennes offensive were characterized by their absolute inflexibility and total disregard for battlefield reality. The demand for a breakout and an uninterrupted, swift drive to Antwerp was a military dictate from which no deviation was permitted under any circumstance. These non-negotiable demands were transmitted from the Führer's bunker to the front lines, crushing the initiative of experienced commanders. Field Marshal Walther Model and others attempted to argue for a more limited objective, one that was logistically sustainable and realistic given their depleted forces. Hitler's rage, however, was their only reward, as he accused them of being too cautious and lacking the necessary revolutionary spirit for decisive action. The Führer saw any strategic pause or operational shift as a weakness that the enemy would instantly exploit, making total, continuous forward movement his highest priority. This insistence on speed above all else exacerbated the already critical fuel problem across the entire offensive front. The rapid advances that did occur were incredibly costly in terms of both personnel and material, burning through the meager existing fuel stocks at an unsustainable rate. Hitler's personal involvement in minute tactical decisions, often overriding the judgment of local generals, became a paralyzing factor in the German chain of command. His absolute focus on the political and psychological effects of the offensive completely overshadowed any consideration of its underlying logistical framework. The generals in the field were trapped between the tactical necessity of conserving fuel for the final push and the political imperative of obeying the Führer's demand for relentless advance. This impossible contradiction created a state of deep, professional despair among the senior officers trying to manage the complex and failing operation. The unwavering demand was a reflection of Hitler's belief in the power of the will to overcome material constraints, a dangerous and ultimately fatal delusion. He could not conceive of his armored divisions halting for any reason other than a lack of fighting spirit, certainly not for something as mundane as an empty fuel tank. The rigidity of his command structure ensured that the entire operation lacked the necessary tactical flexibility to adapt to the rapid changes on the unpredictable battlefield. The first 3 days of the Ardennes offensive were a period of astonishing, almost unbelievable military success for the desperate German forces. The element of total surprise was achieved perfectly, as the Americans were completely unprepared for a massive German attack in that specific, heavily forested sector. German units, often in a thick fog and heavy snow, achieved deep penetrations, slicing through the thin and disorganized American defensive lines. Major towns and villages were quickly overrun, and thousands of American soldiers were killed, captured, or scattered in the initial, chaotic onslaught. This sudden breakthrough briefly resurrected the specter of the 1940 Blitzkrieg, sending shivers of genuine alarm through the Allied High Command in Paris and London. The German spearheads were moving so fast that their commanders began to genuinely believe that the path to the Meuse River and then Antwerp might actually be open. However, even as the tanks rolled forward, the first signs of the strategic, crippling weakness of the entire operation began to manifest. The crucial supply lines behind the rapidly moving front were becoming hopelessly tangled and jammed on the narrow, icy roads of the Ardennes. American defensive pockets, bypassed in the initial rush, were proving far more tenacious and resourceful than the German planners had anticipated. The most famous of these resistance points was the key road junction of Bastogne, heroically defended by the 101st Airborne Division, which acted as a massive, immobile cork in the German advance. Every successful mile gained on the map added an exponential burden to the German fuel consumption and logistical difficulty. The rapid forward movement, initially celebrated as a triumph, was in fact accelerating the entire German force toward an inevitable, crippling halt. The fleeting hope of total victory was already being eroded by the harsh realities of the battlefield, American resilience, difficult terrain, and the profound lack of fuel. The weather, initially a German ally, trapping Allied air power on the ground, would soon break, allowing the overwhelming might of the American Air Force to dominate the skies. The initial shock of the German breakthrough quickly galvanized the massive, superior forces of the American and British armies. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, swiftly and decisively committed powerful reserves to contain the widening German salient. The American counterstrike was characterized by a massive deployment of infantry, artillery, and armored divisions converging rapidly on the flanks of the German thrust. The weather broke, and the skies cleared, allowing the full fury of Allied air power to be unleashed upon the German supply columns and ground troops. Fighter bombers relentlessly attacked German vehicles, turning the snow-covered roads into gauntlets of fire and destruction, severely slowing the already struggling logistical efforts. Crucially, the determined defense of key nodal points like Bastogne forced the German armored columns to take longer, circuitous routes, further depleting their precious fuel. The American ability to mobilize and sustain a massive counterattack highlighted the fundamental, overwhelming asymmetry of resources in the entire conflict. While the Germans were gambling their last reserves, the Allies possessed an industrial and manpower base that could absorb and immediately counter the heavy losses. General George S. Patton Jr.'s celebrated and rapid pivot of the American Third Army from the south to relieve Bastogne became a decisive turning point in the battle. This extraordinary feat of military logistics demonstrated the flexibility and command authority that had been utterly lacking in the rigid German command structure. The American forces began to attack the flanks of the German penetration, tightening the bulge and steadily reducing the operational area available to the German tanks. This continuous pressure ensured that the German armored divisions could never pause long enough to consolidate their positions or effectively scrounge for fuel. The counterstrike transformed the battle from a sweeping offensive into a desperate, attritional fight for survival for the German soldiers caught in the tightening Allied ring. The German dream of reaching the Meuse River and splitting the Allies was now irretrievably lost, replaced by the grim reality of a full-scale retreat. The mechanical heart of the Ardennes offensive was the German tank, and its lifeblood was rapidly becoming a non-existent commodity. The mighty King Tiger and Panther tanks, formidable in combat, were also monstrously inefficient consumers of the finite fuel supply. Each mile advanced into the icy, challenging terrain brought the German armored divisions closer to their operational terminus. By Christmas 1944, the lead German elements were only miles from the Meuse River, but they were almost universally reporting critically low or completely empty fuel tanks. The ambitious plan to seize American fuel depots along the way had failed completely, thwarted by American vigilance and the swift destruction of the supplies. The sight of massive, abandoned German tanks, perfectly operational but completely immobile, littering the Belgian countryside became a common, devastating symbol of the campaign's failure. These powerful steel behemoths, designed to deliver a crushing knockout blow, had become nothing more than glorified, frozen pillboxes for their dejected crews. The decision to scuttle or abandon a tank was always heartbreaking for the crews, a clear and undeniable admission that the war was now irretrievably lost. German commanders began issuing desperate, almost pleading requests for emergency fuel drops, which the decimated Luftwaffe was entirely incapable of delivering with any real effect. The lack of fuel not only immobilized the armored forces but also critically affected the mobility of the German infantry and the transport of essential ammunition and rations. The fuel crisis completely shattered the central tenet of the German offensive, the ability to maintain a rapid, continuous, unceasing forward thrust. Hitler's grand strategy had been completely nullified, not by a single, crushing defeat in battle, but by a catastrophic, cascading logistical breakdown. The simple, mundane reality of an empty fuel gauge proved to be a far more potent and effective weapon against the German army than any number of Allied artillery shells. The tank's thirst was the single, most definitive failure of the entire Ardennes gamble, turning a tactical success into a profound strategic disaster. The fate of the German offensive was not sealed by a lack of fighting spirit but by the relentless efficiency of the Allied intelligence services. Crucial to the Allied response was the steady stream of information provided by Ultra, the Allied code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park. The decryption of German radio traffic provided the Allied commanders with an astonishing, real-time insight into the German order of battle and their strategic vulnerabilities. The Allies possessed not only the knowledge of the where of the German attack but, more importantly, the critical intelligence of the why and how it was structured. Intelligence reports quickly began to highlight the extreme fuel consumption and the specific, desperate German reliance on captured Allied stocks. This critical knowledge allowed the Allied commanders to focus their defense not just on resisting the advance but on denying the Germans their essential fuel supplies. Orders were rapidly disseminated to rear echelon units to destroy all fuel and supply depots immediately upon the approach of any German unit. The intelligence success turned the entire German plan completely on its head, transforming the anticipated capture of fuel into an organized, systematic denial. Allied air power, once the skies cleared, was guided with precision to target known German fuel convoys and logistics bottlenecks, maximizing the impact of every sortie. The German High Command's rigid secrecy and reliance on radio communication, ironically, provided the very means of its own undoing to the highly effective Allied cryptologists. The full extent of the German fuel crisis was likely known to the Allied command even before it was fully realized by the commanders in the field of the Wehrmacht. The ability to act on this critical intelligence provided the Allies with a decisive, strategic advantage that far outweighed the initial shock of the surprise attack. The quiet, systematic work of the intelligence officers in the secure backrooms determined the ultimate strategic failure of Hitler's massive military gamble. The process of the fuel crisis being accepted by the German High Command was a slow, agonizing descent from denial into catastrophic realization. The reports filtering back to the Wolfschanze were initially dismissed as isolated incidents or the defeatist overreactions of overly cautious field commanders. Hitler's inner circle, terrified of his eruptive temper, were often reluctant to deliver the unvarnished, devastating truth about the situation at the front. However, the sheer volume and consistency of the reports about stalled tanks and empty fuel gauges eventually became impossible for even the most entrenched denial to dismiss. The crucial moment arrived when the lead elements of the most powerful German armored units, the spearheads closest to the Meuse River, reported a complete and irreversible halt. The most shocking and undeniable evidence was the rapid appearance of abandoned, brand-new King Tiger tanks, their immense power rendered inert by lack of gasoline. This was the final, devastating, material proof that the logistical foundation of the entire offensive had catastrophically collapsed. A specific, grim report from a senior commander, likely a panzer general, detailing the inability of his entire division to move another kilometer without fuel, was the final straw. The report would have been delivered in the sterile, tension-filled atmosphere of the bunker map room, watched by a silent, terrified assembly of general officers. The news was not merely a tactical setback, it was a total, complete validation of the very warnings Hitler had furiously dismissed for weeks. It confirmed that the German army did not have the capability to sustain a major offensive, regardless of the brilliance of the initial planning. This moment of revelation was a total shattering of the last major strategic illusion Hitler possessed about the ultimate, inevitable outcome of the war. Hitler's reaction to the undeniable news of the complete fuel exhaustion was characteristic of his rapidly deteriorating psychological state, a violent, terrifying eruption of rage. The initial shock of the news was immediately metabolized into a furious search for a scapegoat, as he absolutely refused to accept any personal responsibility for the catastrophic failure. He completely blamed his field commanders, accusing them of incompetence, cowardice, and an inherent lack of the necessary fanaticism to press the attack forward. His voice would have been a high-pitched, screaming tirade, echoing throughout the concrete corridors of the subterranean bunker in his utter disbelief and fury. Maps were reportedly torn, furniture was violently overturned, and the assembled generals were subjected to a barrage of hysterical, unfounded accusations of treachery. The content of his tirade would have been a bizarre mix of tactical assessment and manic, political ideological ranting against the historical forces aligned against him. He declared that the failure was not logistical but a moral one, a deficiency in the fighting spirit of the men who had been entrusted with his strategic masterpiece. His immediate and irrational order was to move what little fuel remained to a different sector, entirely ignoring the strategic reality of the main failure. The generals, standing rigidly at attention, would have waited out the storm, knowing that any attempt at a rational counter-argument would only prolong the horrifying verbal assault. This massive eruption was a final, clear display of Hitler's complete loss of contact with the objective military realities of the collapsing German position. The rage was not merely about a failed offensive, it was the psychological manifestation of realizing that his last, grand, personal military gambit had ended in total, humiliating failure. The emotional violence of the outburst confirmed to everyone present that the Führer was no longer a rational military leader but a cornered, psychologically broken dictator. The terrifying scene in the bunker was a prelude to the total breakdown of German command authority in the final, desperate months of the Second World War. Following the initial, explosive outburst, Hitler retreated into a more chilling, long-term state of psychological and strategic denial. He continued to insist that the Ardennes campaign was merely a temporary setback, a missed opportunity caused by the failures of others, not a fundamentally flawed plan. The Führer began issuing increasingly delusional, nonsensical orders to imaginary armies and ghost divisions that no longer had the capacity to maneuver or fight. His personal focus shifted from the Western Front to the impending catastrophe on the Eastern Front, where the massive Soviet offensive was already shattering German lines. The realization that the fuel was gone meant the total abandonment of any further major offensive action on the Western Front for the remainder of the war. The Wehrmacht's remaining operational reserves, which were squandered in the Ardennes, could now never be replenished, ensuring a purely defensive and losing strategy. The reckoning for Hitler was a quiet, internal acceptance that the military war was now irrevocably lost, leading to an increasing focus on the political and existential consequences. He began to view the German people themselves as having failed him, seeing their inability to achieve total victory as a mark of their own inherent racial weakness. This profound disillusionment hardened his resolve toward the apocalyptic Nero decree, which ordered the systematic destruction of all remaining German infrastructure. His logic was that if he could not have Germany, then absolutely no one else should be permitted to have it either, preferring total ruin over surrender. The failure of the Ardennes, fundamentally caused by the lack of fuel, directly accelerated the descent into the final, horrific months of the war, leading to the collapse of the Third Reich. The realization that the last chance for a strategic turnaround was gone permanently sealed Hitler's fate in the increasingly claustrophobic confines of the Berlin bunker. The final phase of the war was characterized by this profound, toxic mix of strategic denial and an increasingly self-destructive, murderous political vengeance. The Battle of the Bulge, and its catastrophic logistical failure due to the fuel shortage, left deep, indelible scars on the map of World War II. The offensive resulted in a massive, irreversible drain on the German army's operational reserves, including tanks, aircraft, and, most importantly, highly trained, irreplaceable manpower. The total German losses were staggering, effectively crippling the Wehrmacht's ability to mount any meaningful resistance against the final Allied offensives in the spring of 1945. The strategic consequence of the fuel failure was the complete paralysis of the German forces on the Western Front at the very moment they desperately needed mobility to counter the Allied advance. The critical resources consumed in the Ardennes could not be redeployed to the Eastern Front, thus accelerating the massive and relentless Soviet drive toward Berlin. The battle irrevocably shortened the overall duration of the war by months, preventing Hitler from drawing out the conflict into a protracted, devastating defense of the German heartland. For the Allies, the battle demonstrated their immense logistical power, their resilience in defense, and the unwavering effectiveness of their superior air power. The story of the immobilized tanks and the empty fuel tanks became a legendary, grim warning about the ultimate futility of war without a functioning supply chain. The historical echo of Hitler's final rage, the moment he grasped the total failure of his last gamble, serves as a crucial lesson in the dangers of strategic delusion and isolation. The physical scars of the Ardennes remain in the snow-covered forests and quiet Belgian villages, a permanent testament to the violence of the largest land battle fought by the United States Army in World War II. The battle's devastating conclusion finalized the shift from a war of movement to a war of attrition, a contest that Germany was now absolutely certain to lose. The ultimate price of Hitler's fuel-dependent fantasy was paid in the final, brutal destruction of his last operational armies and the acceleration of Germany's total defeat.